My name is Jim Slazewski. I'm the College or University now Registrar. So please allow me to introduce Holly Fredwell, a research fellow from the Property and Environmental Research Center, as well as Jeffrey Marshall, who's president of the Heritage Conservancy. Holly is a faculty member also at Montana State University and has taught courses in economics and natural resources, and also gives workshops to high school students on environmental economics, I believe.
Most of the high school teachers.
Most of the high school teachers, I'm sorry, high school
Yeah,
teachers. She is also the author of Who is Minding the Federal Estate? Political Management of America's Public Lands. Jeffrey Marshall is the president of the Heritage Conservancy and has 25 years experience in land protection and historic preservation. He has given public education programs and acts as a preservation advocate in the community. He's the author of several books and is a nationally recognized expert in land conservation and historic preservation. So I leave you presenting each for about 20 to 30 minutes, and then there'll be a discussion after that. All right. So Holly, take it away.
Thank you very much. Well, I come from Bozeman, Montana, so I hear all these stories of kids not getting out, and we're very fortunate because our kids get outside all the time. Maybe not during the class day, but certainly after class. We are surrounded by public lands, and so that really is my passion, is thinking about public lands and how they're managed, because I think they're very mismanaged, and I'd like to see them managed much better, and I'd like to see much more conservation on lands that not only are public lands, but I'd like to see better conservation on those public lands and on our private lands as well. So that's sort of where I'm coming from. And when we think of our public lands, I don't know what you guys think about out here, but when I think of public lands and in the West, we think of sort of these big, huge mountains, these parks. This is actually Grand Teton National Park right here, one of my favorite parks in the world because it's absolutely stunning. We think about wide open spaces, rangelands. We have a lot of this sort of sagebrush prairie land around Montana and out in the West. We think of forests, just these huge, vast amounts of timber and forest land. This particular forest land happens to be rather bug infested, as we'll be able to see when the lights dim down, which is becoming very common in the West. We also think of production. It's that timber production, it's grazing production, it's our minerals, our oil and gas, the things that we use. It's also cultural artifacts, all these different things that come to mind when we're thinking about our public lands and what our public lands are supposed to be providing for us. In the West, we also think about fire. I don't know how much you guys are familiar with fire, but over 11 million acres burned this year. Something like 8 million acres, almost 9 million acres last year. Last year we spent over $1.7 billion just suppressing wildfire. And that doesn't include any of the cost of damage that was done. That is just the fire suppression cost. So fire and fighting wildfire, and especially that suppression more so than trying to prevent it, is what's really taking up a big part of our public lands budget. I want to start off with a quick quiz for you guys. How much land in the United States is federally owned? Rebecca's not allowed to answer this because she just answered the other half of it. How much is privately owned? But how much is federally owned? How much is public? What do you think?
10%.
10%.
Let's say, like 75% is federally owned.
75%. Anybody else in between? Okay. The other question I want you to think about is, why do we have federal lands? And I'm going to leave that one unanswered right now. I want you guys to think about it as I'm talking, and I want to discuss that when we're done, because that's a really important question. Why do we have federal lands? They were originally set aside, for the most part, to provide us with production. I'll get back to that because we have 4 different federal land agencies that provide different services for us. In fact, when we look at our federal lands, about 27.7% is owned by the public land agencies. Okay? If you add up all the state land agencies and all of the federal land agencies, you come up with about 40% of our land is in the public sector. Okay? Now take a look at this picture, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with what's going on in the West right now, but we have this issue going on. It's called divided lands. The red here is the public land. That's just the federal land. And if you take note, almost 50% of the West is federally owned, compared to about 4% of the East. We deal with some very different issues. Keep in mind, we're talking about federal lands. They do not pay property taxes. Okay, those property taxes that go to fund your education system, to fund your counties, to fund the local issues that you have. Instead, they pay in lieu of taxes monies that generally come from the revenues earned on those public lands. Well, our public land revenues have declined dramatically over time as we've decreased the production that's taking place on those lands. We've reduced our timber harvest by 80%. We've cut our grazing in about half there. We've reduced the amount of minerals production that's going on in those lands. So those revenues are declining, which causes some serious problems for those local communities and how those local communities are now being able to sustain themselves. They need to start thinking about some other ways. So that's a really important factor for us to keep in mind. If we look at some of these states in the West, Nevada, 81% federal. Utah, 66% federal. Idaho, 61% federal. That is a lot of federal land. That is a lot of land that's managed not by the local constituencies, but rather these are our lands, right? These are America's public lands, so everybody has a say in them, and that's essentially how they're being managed, sort of, at this point. But let me move down and think a little bit about what these different agencies are. We have 4 federal land agencies. The Bureau of Land Management is the largest federal agency. It owns about 40% of the public estate. And the Bureau of Land Management provides a lot of land for grazing and is also the manager of most of our oil and gas production and our minerals production. The Forest Service owns another 30% of the federal lands. The Forest Service was initially set aside to provide timber for use and a continuous supply of water. And when you think of the Forest Service today, what do they provide? Any thoughts? Nobody here uses the Forest Service lands? Yeah, Forest Service lands and our BLM lands are now what we call multiple use lands. They are managed and required to provide not only for the timber production, the grazing production, the minerals production, but also for recreation, for wildlife habitat, for conservation, for water quality, for all these different goals that we have when we think about conservation. They are not to maximize revenues. That's not one of their goals. Instead, they're to try to provide for the best use of these lands. How do they decide what that best use is? And I'll come back to those ideas in a minute, but I want you to think about what you think those lands should be managed for and how you would use them. They're my backyard. I use them all the time. I bike, I hike, I ski in those lands at least 3 times a week. So I'm very, very fortunate, and I'd like to thank you all for helping pay for my recreation. So when we think about these multiple use lands, we have all sorts of different recreation activities, both here in the east and in the west. Sometimes they get along pretty well, and sometimes they don't. I am not an off-road vehicle rider, although I know many people that are. I don't like, as I think it was John was saying this morning, I don't really like it. Hiking is what I do. I hike and I bike. I don't like hiking for 5 hours to get back in the backcountry and then have the motorcycle rider ride by me. But it happens, right? It definitely happens. So sometimes we can think of conflicting uses that exist on these lands. We do have grazing on our public lands. That is one of the rights for our ranchers on lands. We have reintroduced wolves into Yellowstone National Park back in 96, but it might have been 98. And so we have wolves that now also cause some additional problems because there are conflicting uses of these resources. So when we look at our public land managers, when we look at the agency managers, one of their jobs, their most important job in fact, is to determine how to allocate for these competing demands. Right? If we were to look at the marketplace, markets would say we're going to move towards that where we have the highest value use. But our public land managers are instead required to think about the public input and think about the political process in order to determine how to actually manage these landscapes. So we moved from a state of producing a lot of commodity production on these lands. As I said, on our forests, we've cut down timber harvest by about 80% to more of an ecosystem services type management. And that ecosystem services type management, however, is not so much managed by the land managers on these agencies that are on the ground, but a lot of it's managed by our politicians. Because our politicians are the ones that are responsible to hand out the money and to appropriate the dollars. So our politicians essentially drive a lot of what is happening and a lot of which action and activity is going to take place here. So coming to this idea, first of all though, of this conservation, this ecosystem service idea, this is a really popular bumper sticker in Bozeman. Keep it wild. What does that mean? I was really interested to hear John say that this morning, but when you're not connected to the land, what does that mean? And in the Pacific Northwest, back in 1990, the northern spotted owl was put on the endangered species list. And at that same time, we created what was called the Pacific Northwest Forest Plan. and we restricted 24 million acres in Washington State and a little bit of Oregon from timber harvest to protect the northern spotted owl. Today, what is that, 25 years later, the northern spotted owl is really not doing any better. Instead, we've created this great habitat for the barred owl, which is the more aggressive, larger cousin of the northern spotted owl. So when it comes down to us trying to manage and micromanage what's going on in the landscape, we do have science that we can lean to, but science doesn't tell us the exact outcome, and science doesn't tell us what is better. Was the timber harvest better? And northern spotted owls actually do live in second growth. Or is the barred owl better? That is a public policy decision. That's not a decision that science can answer for us. So let's look at another example here. These particular pictures are from Yosemite National Park. The top is El Capitan in 1868. The two middle photos are from 1944. One is before harvest, one is after harvest. Yes, oh my God, they harvested timber in the park. Okay? Our national parks cover about 13% of our federal lands, and they are there to protect the scenery and the enjoyment of the general public. And the scenery here in 1944, it was believed that being able to see that view of El Capitan was very important. It's a lot more contentious to harvest timber today. So you see in 2009, from that same viewpoint, you cannot see El Capitan. Okay? Should we harvest or should we not harvest? This is not a science question. This is a personal opinion question, right? Or what is the goal of the National Park Service? Is it to provide for the scenery, or is it to protect nature? But nature's dynamic. Nature changes all the time. Nature does not, it's not a still photo, right? It's put by Daniel Bachman, the ecologist. It's not a still photo, it's a moving picture show, right? It's continually changing. The bottom picture here is Yosemite Valley from Union Point, 1866, again to 2009. And you can see how the timber has encroached in on the valley there. The trees are growing. That's part of nature. So was it better in 1866? And what happened in 1866 that's not happening now? And we oftentimes think, well, man is not a part of nature. We should just let it do its thing, and that's what national parks are for, to protect this pristine nature. But if you go back to this 1866 picture, that's when Native Americans were in this picture, and they did burn the landscape. And they did cut timber, and they did use the resources. Part of the reason they burned was to use the resources to clear land so that they could grow crops, and to clear lands so they could create forage for wildlife, because that was their livelihood. They were part of the landscape as well. So what is nature? What is wild? And if we want to go back to some ecosystem services that's providing some pristine nature, what point is it? Is there some point in time that's better than another point in time? And how do you decide what that is? If you go to Flagstaff, Arizona, about 100 years ago, right outside of Flagstaff, it was called Antelope Springs because they had these big, huge ponderosa pine trees, also called yellow pine, and they were widely dispersed apart, so you could actually get wagon trains to flow through them or to roll through them. And the antelope would bound joyfully through the savanna, right? So we have 70-year-old trees that are huge. If you go to those same forests today, 70-year-old trees are this big. We've taken away fire. Okay? Fire in a ponderosa pine forest burns about every 5 to 25 years. We've taken away fire for 100 or more years, and as a result, it has not thinned out the forest naturally, and so the trees have become much more dense. We now have about 1,000 trees per acre instead of 40 to 50 trees per acre, and it's changed the structure of the forest, and it's made it susceptible to huge conflagrations, some of which we've seen this year, where the entire forest burns down, rather than dropping to the ground and burning some of the smaller trees and thinning out the forest. So today, you cannot find antelope in these forests. You find the goshawk, which is actually an endangered species. Which is better? Science can't tell us which is better. Science can tell us how to manage for one or the other. Science can tell us how to get to different outcomes, or at least what we expect to be different outcomes. We may or may not get there, right? The spotted owl, we didn't get there, even though we tried. But nonetheless, when we think about what is wild and how we want to manage these lands, we need to have some pretty specific goals as to what we actually want, or we're going to get to sort of default management. And that's where most of our lands are going right now, is this default management of hands-off, whether it's in our national parks because we think that they should be pristine, or whether it's in our national forests because we have a really hard time getting in there harvesting timber. If you go back into the late 80s, the national forest was harvesting an immense amount of timber, perhaps too much timber. right? Perhaps timber that was not sustainable. There are definitely examples of unsustainable timber harvest on our national forest lands back in the 1980s, prior to when we really started to tip to the other direction and remove timber harvest. But remember, when we're managing our national forest, it's not to maximize profits. We cut on forest lands that private owners would never cut on because it made absolutely no sense. Because the cost to harvest that timber and to get it off the land was far more than the value of the timber itself. And the cost to regrow the timber was far more than the value of the timber that we got off of some of these lands. We have very different incentives on our public lands when we're managing them than we do on our private lands. And so if we're going to manage our public lands, we need to know what we're managing for and have a better idea of how to actually get there and align the incentives of management with the outcomes that we're actually desiring to get. So even if we know what we're managing for, say the spotted owl, we may or may not get there. And let me just give you some examples on our national parks. 90% of all of our roadways in national parks are in fair to poor condition. Over a third of park trails are in poor or seriously deficient condition. Sewer and water systems in Grand Teton, Yellowstone, Yosemite need repair. They're actually leaking into the neighboring streams. Glacier historic hotels have failing electrical systems that pose fire hazards. I already said, looking at our national forest, 11 million acres have burned this year. That's not just on federal land, that's total land across the country. More than 9 million acres were burned last year at a cost of more than $1.7 billion in suppression alone. Oftentimes people will say, well, we're loving our public lands to death, right? I would say we just have the wrong incentives for our managers. And it's not that we don't have good managers. We have amazing people that work on our public lands, but they have the wrong incentives. And they don't have the right flexibility to get the job done as to what job they are trying to get done. This picture is kind of hard to see here, but this amazed me. I was in Yellowstone with my dad, who is this guy right here, last summer, and we were in this parking lot. It's one of the famous boardwalks where you go around and you look at the hot pots and the boiling waters. And there were, I counted over 200 cars. There were 2 outhouses. Okay, 2 outhouses. Here's one outhouse, and here's the other outhouse. And you can see this big, huge, long line, and actually the line came over this way, so we couldn't see the line here. I was actually just trying to get my dad so you can see what this was. But that's the state of many of our national parks. 200 cars, can you imagine how many people are there? And there are 2 outhouses. How do you think that smelled when I got inside? It was not very pleasant. But what's happening in our national parks and other public lands is we're not getting the maintenance and the infrastructure that we actually need to maintain the land so that we can continue to enjoy them. Now you might want to say, well, we don't want people on them, but then you're really going to lose the support. And one of the goals of the national parks was for the enjoyment of people, and was to get people out into nature, to see nature, and to experience some of these great experiences that we have in our national parks. Aren't only just for wildlife and beautiful wilderness. We also have those cultural parks. We have historic parks. We have all sorts of different types of parks that really provide a great education for us, but they're not being managed very well. They're not being managed well because of the different types of management that we continually see on our lands, which is really political allocation. Our federal land agencies get budgets that are appropriated from Congress. If they don't spend that money in the year that they get it budgeted, sometimes it's a 2-year budget, then it goes back to the general treasury. So the goal is to spend it all, right? The goal is to spend it all. But sometimes you have a rainy day, and so you have to sort of manage your landscape holding on to whatever discretionary funding you have, and at the end of your fiscal year you say, ooh, I have a bunch of money, I have to spend it right now, because if I don't spend it right now, I have to give it back, and I'm probably not going to get as big of a budget back the following year. So we're managing in response to politicians. When our managers want to increase their funding, they go to politicians and they say, I need money. And politicians say, well, what do you need it for? Let's see what we can create that's a benefit to me, right? Our politicians have their own interest in heart. It's not because they're bad people, maybe they are, but they're not all necessarily bad people, but the incentives that they have are to get voted into office. To get voted into office, you have to provide your constituents with visible benefits. You want to hide the cost and you want to demonstrate the benefits that you're providing. That is what it takes to be a politician. So when we think about what's happening in our national parks, instead of managing for these little day-to-day issues, we're getting more national parks, right? We have, since 2000, 26 new national parks have been created. Appropriations to the national park system remain flat. We have 7 new national parks that were added last year, 9 more that were expanded, more that are being proposed. And a lot of people say, well, you know, this is a really easy problem. Congress should just appropriate more money. Our national parks are 1/15 of 1% of the total federal budget. Our total federal lands are something like 1/4 of 1% of the total federal budget. So Congress should just give more money. We go to Congress and say, well, instead of funding education, you need to provide our federal lands with more money. Instead of funding Medicaid, all those baby boomers that are now entering this age, you need to give us more money to our national parks, not Social Security, right? So think of the other places where our congressmen are trying to allocate money. That money's not coming. I've given the same presentation for 20 years. That money is still not coming. Okay, it's probably less likely to come today than it is 20 years ago when I started studying public lands and saying, why don't we get more money for these lands? If we look at what's happening on our national park system, we have a budget deficit, or excuse me, a deferred maintenance of $11.5 billion. Congress appropriates less than half of what the national park system says they need to maintain that deferred maintenance and not have it grow over time. Okay, so that deferred maintenance is going to continue to increase unless we do something. And Congress is not likely to provide more money for this. 2016 is the National Park Service centennial. Oh, I forgot about this picture. This was my ribbon cutting picture, so I'll take a step back, because one of the things for politicians is so much easier and more fun and sexier to create new parks, new monuments, new ribbon cutting ceremonies, new big infrastructures, rather than maintain the existing infrastructures we have. This gets attention, this gains votes. Right? This was actually in 1990, declaring a grand staircase Escalante with Clinton and Gore. I figured you guys would probably know those two guys at any rate, hence the reason to use that picture. But nonetheless, that's what's gaining votes. It's not this other stuff. It's not maintaining the day-to-day structure. It's not keeping these forests going. It's not keeping these parks going to continue to use. It's creating more and more. And as we create more and more, that deferred maintenance problem is going to get bigger and bigger. It's not going to go away. So as we enter into 2016, I'd like to say I think it's time to really make our parks worth celebrating and the rest of our federal lands worth celebrating by taking better care of them and starting to think outside the box. Let's not just rely on Congress. Let's not just rely on government to take care of these problems for us, because I don't think they're doing a very good job. And we've seen that year after year after year. There are better ways. So I'm going to throw at you a menu of different options that we can think about to better manage our public lands and to change the incentives so that we can get the management for the outcomes that we would really want to see. However, to get there, we first need to know what those outcomes are, right? I think on our parks, we're pretty clear on what that is. On our national forest lands, on our BLM lands, it is much less clear as to what it is that we really expect these lands to do for us. Remember, that's your job. You're supposed to be thinking about what those lands are supposed to be providing for us. So, a menu of options. Fees. Federal Lands and Recreation Enhancement Act was passed in 2004 following a fee demonstration program in 1996 that allowed revenues that were generated from fees, entry fees, and other user fees in our parks and other federal lands to stay on the landscape, to stay in that unit. When Yosemite charges you a mere, I think it's like $25 for a carload of people to enter and exit the park for 7 days, when they charge that, 80% of that can now stay in the parks instead of being returned to the general treasury. They can use that money on the ground to help manage the parks, and now we've created a link between the visitor and the manager, saying, you as a visitor are coming in saying, these are the things I want to see, and the manager saying, I can directly respond to you now, instead of politicians that really want to see some big ribbon cutting, right? So we've reconnected that link between the visitor and the manager, encouraging managers to respond to what we as visitors want, and also providing additional revenues for managers to respond to the things that they think are necessary on the landscape. Reforming the LWCF, Land and Water Conservation Fund, is set aside as, well, there's monies, I should say, set aside $900 million annually that could potentially go for both federal and stateside conservation uses. The problem with the federal, well, first of all, only about $100 million of that is appropriated annually. The problem with the federal side is it is required to use for land acquisition. So if you own a home and you don't have barely enough income to take care of it, and you have a leaky roof that you just really can't afford to take care of right now, are you going to buy another home? Would that be a smart decision? That's what we're doing on our public lands. We are buying more lands. We are setting aside more lands where we can't take care of what we want. So reforming the Land and Water Conservation Fund, saying, well, if you're going to allocate this money, at least let us use it where we need it most. So that deferred maintenance is one place where we really need to see some of those monies go. More local control. You saw that divide earlier on on the states where 50% of the land is federally owned in the western half. A number of different states have actually proposed to transfer federal lands to state ownership. Okay? At PERC, we actually did a study. It's called Divided Lands. This is not advocating for or against transferring the lands. It was saying, whoa, this is a big step. You guys need to think about what you're talking about here. Okay? We have looked at the state trust lands. Many of these proposals have said we want to transfer these to state trust lands. State trust lands are lands that were created back when each of the individual states were created. They are lands that are scattered across the state, anywhere from 1 to 4 sections of each township. Were provided to the state to generate revenues to help fund the state institutions, in particular our K-12 schools. That's the biggest state institution that is funded through the state trusts. And we look at those state trust lands, they're managed for multiple uses. They're managed for harvesting timber. They allow for grazing. They allow for recreation. They have some conservation. They generate revenues. They are required to maximize revenues. Remember, our public lands are not required to maximize revenues. So that, as no surprise, and as you'll find in here, and people go, wow, and I say, why is that surprising? These are the results we'd expect. Required to maximize revenues, states do a really good job doing it. And they also manage for the lands, because they have to for the long term. They're required to generate revenues forever into the future. Federal lands are not. They're losing money on every single activity they manage for, except minerals. They're not required to maximize revenues. Right? That's not their goal, and that's not the incentives that are being provided. So I don't know why people think this is so fascinating and amazing. In my mind, it's exactly what we would expect. Okay? But the reason we did this report again was to say, well, if you really want to transfer these to state trusts, let's look at what state trusts are doing. If you're going to take state trusts now, cover about 4% of the West. If you're going to take all that federal land, and it was with the exceptions, it's all the multiple use lands. It's not parks, it's not wilderness areas. If you're going to take all that land and transfer it to the states, you're going to come up with some very different problems, and those are some of the issues we're working on at PERC right now. So again, not advocating for or against transferring these lands, but saying that there are some better systems that exist out there that we really should be looking at, and maybe some of these lands could be better cared for. I would say they definitely could be better cared for at a much local level. More local level, where we have stakeholders that are actually benefiting from good use, that are also being burdened if we have bad use. Those people that are neighbors of some of these wildfires and some of these clear cuts and other things that are going on our public lands. Public-private partnerships. We have all sorts of public-private partnerships that take place. We can do a lot more here. We have outfits that actually manage state parks at the private level. They lease the parks essentially from the states. They manage them, they give the states back money from revenues that they earn. They do it at a lower cost because they don't have the same stringent regulations that the states do, right? Especially when it comes to labor. They can actually hire individuals to do the jobs they're looking to do rather than be required to hire people with certain levels of education. In Bozeman, Montana, we have a great little trail that we hike up to what's called the M. It's 1.5 miles up. People take their dogs. It's really a major dog path, in fact. And we are paying somebody over $30,000 a year to come clean up dog poop on that trail, because the Forest Service has to abide by their labor requirements, and so they have to continue to pay somebody from their office to clean that stuff up, rather than a private entrepreneur being able to come in and pay my kids who could really use a job. And they would gladly do it, but they might do it for 10 or 15 bucks an hour. 15, they do it in a heartbeat. Okay. So national parks. Again, we look at expanding our national park system. Do we really want to continue to add more and more land here? Here's an idea. What if we allowed private entrepreneurs that were interested in adding parks? North Main Woods is coming to mind. They want to add parks to the national park system. How about they manage it? They keep it in private hands, and they manage it according to national park specifications. They brand it as a national park. It's like a franchise. Oh, God, I used that word. I'm not supposed to use that word. But literally, right? It's privately managed according to the national park system regulations. We're not expanding our overall federal land. Instead, we're starting to get some more of these partnerships taking place. Charter parks and forests. You've all heard of charter schools. Oh, I didn't bring it up here. We have a little policy series at PERC written by Bob Nelson of Maryland University on charter parks. Take that charter school idea and pull together a board to start managing some of these lands at a more local level that have a better idea of what's actually going on the landscape. So I'll end up with conservation means doing more with less. Our federal lands right now and are continually doing less for more. And if we really want to get better stewardship, better conservation, we need to start thinking about aligning the incentives of those managers so that we get the outcomes that we're really looking for. And with that, I'm beyond my time, so thank you for coming and joining us.
That's my break. You did all the time.
I had to do that quick.
You did a great job. My name is Jeff Marshall. I'm the president of a local land trust called the Heritage Conservancy. It does historic preservation and land conservation. So it's a bit unique in the land trust world. And as a nonprofit, I am always out there pitching who we are, so there's some membership brochures. But I'm not sure what the level of sophistication is up there. Experience in open space and management of open space is the group. So I'm going to start with the basics and hopefully rev up to some rather more topical issues. First of all, when we talk about open space, we in Heritage Conservancy, that term is very generic. I mean, I've been to more than one presentation where someone's gotten up in the audience and said, open space is wasted space. So that's the one's philosophy. And then we hear the other side, that pristine and now I'm not touching. So that's not the reality of the world. To me, open space, and I'm going to read some of these stuff, natural areas such as forests and grasslands, as well as working farms, ranches, and timberlands. And open space can include parks, streams, river corridors, other natural areas within urban, suburban, or rural areas. And here's the key for us. Open space lands can be either protected or unprotected, public or private. And so what I deal in, majority, is protected open space, which is the idea that either by zoning or overlay or some manner like that, development is limited or controlled to create a relatively undeveloped area of land or water within a community or region. And this protected open space can also be publicly owned or owned by a nonprofit. So there's owned land, and I'm going to come back to another aspect of that. A lot of people confuse the purposes for that, why we did that. The environmental, social, economic benefits with the amenities that come with it. And there's a real distinction in the creation and protection of open space and managing of open space, of whether you're dealing with amenities such as scenic beauties, places to recreate, clean water, wildlife to view, hunt, fish, or other land-based livelihoods, farming, ranching, forestry, things that we've just heard that go on public and private lands. And more importantly, not importantly, but they go on much more on private lands because that's why most people own their land. And we have to deal with people, and I'll come back to that. The curse of that is those amenities are attracting more people to the very areas that we're preserving. So it's very interesting, victim of your own success, where the area becomes more and more important for people to move to. And we see a gentrification. We see indigenous people, and not Native Americans, but the locals who grew up in a community not being able to afford to live in the community where they grew up. It's bad in Central Bucks, Doylestown, Solbright, Upper Mayfield. I was in Wyoming, and the complaint in one of the rural, the famous tourist towns was, well, the billionaires are pushing up the millionaires. And, we're not quite there yet, but that idea of protecting open space is becoming an amenity people look for. So, all this is involved with the term conservation, which Holly did mention, which I thought was interesting very much in her presentation. But conservation, is the preservation and management of open space to maintain a couple of reasons, and I'll come back to environmental, economic, and social benefits that somebody thinks is important. And so the key conservation tools are purchase of public land, we've heard a lot about that, conservation easements, which I'll talk about, sustainable management practices, and smart growth. And the latter two are beyond the scope of my organization. We used to dabble in all that, all important. We focus more on what we do. which is conservation easements and ownership of a small amount of land. But the idea that you can affect more people by good sustainable management practices, teaching them, and smart growth through legislation is a very common philosophy. The buzzwords we used to say is own the best is own the rest. The problem with zoning is it changes. It changes even faster than the environment changes. It changes with political winds. And we have a number of situations where there have been long-term commitments to open space in the community. New board of supervisors come in, and we're dealing with a community in Central Bucks that now want to give back money that had been allocated for open space. They want to reduce taxes and somehow move the money, which legislatively they probably can, from an open space fund to reduce the general operating costs. And in fact, a candidate ran up to Clapham, let's sell our conservation easements back to property owners so that we have more money to pay for police, school, and all the other necessities of life in the community. So that's an important aspect. Again, the lands that we protect open space, protected open space are typically natural lands, which in Bucks County are increasingly rare. Working lands, or what we call cultural landscapes, where the hand of man has been there, but there are still rural social amenities and features, farmlands, pastures and things, which aren't really natural, but are part of the rural amenities that people want to preserve. And then recreational lands. And recreation has become more and more important in the competition for resources that we see now. So managing lands for recreation has become critical in southeastern Pennsylvania. I was talking with Kent before the talk. When I started the organization, our philosophy was we would get preserves, and we were protecting land from people. Well, that doesn't resonate much. Now we've switched it 180 degrees, and we're protecting land for people. And people are an important element in the equation. You can't forget people when you're dealing with them, because until a bear, a tree, or a rock owns the land, you have to deal with the people. And when you deal with private lands, that is the most important aspect of the process. We will identify that land is important, and at the end, I always say to our staff, it's about the land, and you put up with the crazy people you deal with, because it's really about the land. But you can't do anything without the people. And so we look at these things, why we protect land. And as a place-based organization, we don't look at it just from ecology or protection of biodiversity or habitat. We have to look at it more broadly, because we have to figure out where our political support is coming from. So we look at it from in terms of ecology is important, but economics. What does it mean? You know, how do you preserve land for future use? How do you keep schools away, which is a equation that I don't believe in, which is conservation equals less houses. And many local initiatives to preserve land is really a goal of reducing the amount of houses that come in their community. It has very little to do with sustainability, very little to do with management, very little to do with enhancement of natural features. It's an important tool we know. And then the other one is ecumenism, or the moral, ethical, spiritual reasons of why we protect open space. And if you ignore that, which is not scientific and very hard to quantify, you're really not doing your job. I can tell you, chapter and verse, for hours at end, why preserving land is food for the body. But if I can convince you it's food for your soul, your engagement has become more visceral. It's become, this is something that is important to me, and you develop a passion for the land in and above food and fiber. And the issue that we find in a lot of land conservation, private lands to conservation easement, is much of the funding for land conservation in this region comes from agricultural conservation. And at agricultural school, I look at that and I recognize that and I think it's important. But it misses the total component of the social aspects. Much of the components of historic preservation being part of that. I always find it humorous that under the Pennsylvania LISA system for rating land for agricultural preservation, you get points for having a historic farm and historic farm buildings. But you can take the money you get from selling your development rights for agriculture and knock down the buildings that got you the points in the first place. So we have this, lack of connectivity in policy. But it is important that we need to understand that. And so we talk about, in our jargon, is, conservation purposes. What are the purposes of preserving the land? I said, we talked about rural, natural, historic character, conservation and preservation of land or water area for the sake of recreational, ecological, environmental, aesthetic, and agricultural, which is again important. And again, I mentioned briefly the management of a community's or region's growth in terms of development, industry, or resource extraction, which has become more and more important in our state. The main tool that Heritage Conservancy and most land trusts use is called the conservation easement. Everybody familiar with the term? If you're not, it's okay, don't raise your hand because I don't want to embarrass you. But a conservation easement is an agreement, a legal binding agreement, a deed, if you were, by which a landowner conveys a promise to a conservation group to use or really refrain from using the land in a way that is outlined within the parameters of the document. So, and which are consistent with the conservation easement. So we typically say, you want to put an easement on it. It's called transfer of development rights in some places. It's a way that you give up the rights to the bundle of rights you have as an American citizen. And typically it's the right to subdivide, it's the right to build houses, it's the right to clear cut, it's the right to pollute streams. Those are the conservation values that we talk about. And every conservation easement has two piles. Restrictions, thou shalt not build here, thou shalt not cut out trees, and reserved rights. As the property owner, I reserve the right to build over here, I reserve the right to build a house for my son, I reserve the right to hunt, to fish, I reserve the right to cut down trees for firewood. And then everything else is in the middle, in the gray area, that is either negotiated or by outlining the conservation objectives is subject to debate. And this brings us back to management. The management of conservation easements, although purchase of the conservation easement is generally less expensive at the outset as compared to buying the fee, the land itself, the long-term costs, potential long-term costs of monitoring an easement on an annual basis, taking future property owners to court to have them abide by the provisions can be very expensive. And the care and feeding of the conservation easement, you know, somebody comes to me and says, can I plant trees over here? Okay, can I build this over there? And the easement is silent on the issue. You have to read through all pages and what was the intent and what are the four corners of the document, but really what was the intent of it. And that we learned, we used to have easements that said you can't use it for commercial activities. That's ridiculous in today's age, because it's not the activity itself, the name of the activity, it's the physical manifestations of the activity we try to manage. And that's become more and more sophisticated. I do a lot of communities that they want to preserve land, and one of the more up-and-coming uses is horse farm. And there are municipalities, when they do these easements, they say you can't use it for commercial equestrian activities. If you have horses, you can do it, it's fine. As a conservationist, I know for a fact, I'm not a scientist, but a conservationist, I haven't done an in-depth analysis. Horse poop from a horse I own is basically the same as horse poop for somebody who's paying rent. And if you're managing the horse poop, that's what I want you to do. Don't manage whether or not I'm being paid to take care of that horse or it's my own horse. And that's the reason I don't like to deal with uses. You know, you see it as a real estate office as compared to a residence. I don't care, except if by zoning, a real estate office needs X feet of impervious coverage for parking, needs lights, needs others. So it's a physical manifestation. So if somebody comes to me and says, can I use this building for that, or can I use this piece of property for farming, that's the issue. Farming is another issue. I deal with farmers, and the easement or the land we have will say, be kept in its natural state, which is ridiculous for farmland. So, as a farmer, can I put up fences? Are fences natural? No. Can I dig a well? Or is a well natural? Then I can't farm it. Well, you can, but not farming the way you want. So, all these well-meaning conversations we have, and sometimes not so well-meaning, but the issues of managing open space in private hands is very, very complex. So, again, I probably jumped ahead that the way that you acquire land or interest in land is fee acquisition. You buy it or it's donated. That's what we call fee simple acquisition. You get all the proper rights, all the benefits and curses of ownership. For a land trust, that includes maintenance, insurance, cleanup, trespassing, all the other stuff. We often get with the right of first refusal so that we can, if someone wants to sell it to somebody else, we get to match it. More and more we're dealing with leases and licenses to manage the land. That we don't own it, but the property owner has an interest in using best management practices and just don't have their own expertise, and so we do some more of that. I mentioned conservation easement. That's the one that we deal the most with. There are also deed restrictions and revert clauses, which we don't like as much because people don't understand a deed restriction is only enforceable by the people the deed restriction says can enforce it. So if you have a deed restriction says you shall not subdivide, and 30, 40 years from now, the people who want to subdivide, they can go back to your heirs who probably lived in Missoula, Montana, or Bozeman, and say, I'll give you $50,000 to extinguish this rate. They say, sure, where do I sign? So deed restrictions, unless they have the right of enforcement by some other people, are not a valid tool. And they're used a lot. The homeowners association uses them, but then the homeowners association has the right of enforcement. I grew up in Levittown. There's a deed restriction that says you can't hang your laundry out on Sunday. Nobody enforces that deed restriction. It's there. So you can't depend on a deed restriction to protect land, so we don't use them very much. We deal with some of the undivided interests, remainder interests, partial interests, timber rights, lumber rights, oil rights, and mineral rights. We deal with a lot. But the key in managing land is acquisition and then management. There is, as we've heard, very similar. There's a lot more money to acquire land, acquire a conservation easement, than there is to monitor and enforce it. Many people think, and you read in the newspaper, Bucks County preserves another farm, whatever acres. What they've done is they've signed a conservation easement. That's the first chapter. That's when the real work starts. That's when you have to be vigilant from this point to perpetuity. We only deal with perpetual easements. Perpetuity is a long time. And people will say, well, what's your definition of perpetuity? And long time is just not scientific. And I say, till the next smart lawyer comes along. And if you don't believe me, there are some famous court cases with the Barnes Foundation, Stephen Gerrard's will, who say perpetuity isn't as long as we thought. But that's a constant issue with what we do, is how we do that. And I want to talk a little bit about management issues that there's an underappreciated requirement of land acquisition that we don't talk about, which is if you have money over here and land over here, they magically come together. And their need for expertise from land trusts, from staff, to make those deals come through, to answer the question beforehand of what does the easement court say, what can we can't do, is critically important to what we do. And unfortunately, it doesn't happen enough. And as a land trust, that we need private support in order to be there when the municipalities have the money to buy the land. And I said, the human dimension is critical to conservation and management. I said, humans are involved every step of the way. And it's interesting, as we look across our history, that the human interests include economic, people have rights, traditions. We've used this land this way, Native Americans or others, we want to do that. Culture, this is how we use land or don't use land. Emotional value, spiritual value. But more importantly, I think the philosophy ranges from plunder to pristine, plunder to paradise, how people use land. And our goal is to swing the needle from plunder to paradise. Not to lock up every piece of land as being completely unused and untouched, but really to manage that scope that we talked about before. See, I have 10 minutes here, so I'm going to skip a lot of this stuff. Management of open lands, open space, natural lands plus working lands provide a lot of basic day-to-day necessities. Water, clean water, natural flood control, reliable water supply. So water, food, farm and ranches that produce all the food, having farm and ranches close to people is important for local sustainable agriculture. Pollination, we're seeing more and more the benefits of conservation in terms of pollination from bees to bats. The wild harvest, hunting and fishing, one that not as active but important. And shelter, wildlife habitat and producing timber and such. And water, food, and shelter, much of that can be done without ever allowing the public to set foot on the land, which is a key issue in terms of land conservation. Is public recreation, are the benefits of the air we breathe, the food we eat, the water we drink enough to make it a sound investment for a funder or for a land trust to be involved? And and not provide the added benefit of public recreation, of public being able to walk on the land that they preserve. Certainly, when you talk about the values for its scenic view or recreation, that's only appreciated by public and by human interaction. But a lot of the land we preserve, the conservation benefits are in and above the human having to be on the land. Again, I said, we're a place-based organization, Bucks, Montgomery County, and our goals are to protect the quality of life in the community as much as the natural and historic resources, because they are interrelated. And we have learned, again, to be relevant, and that's another big word in our business, demonstrating the relevancy that the current generation, we used to say you're doing this for a future generation. That would resonate. People think I'm going to have children, my children should have a better life than I do. I want to protect those oases, I want to protect the food, the water, the fire. Now it doesn't seem to be enough. With all the issues and all the economy, what's in it for me? And we have to establish that relevance. And recreation is a key part of it. You know, almost everybody likes to go on vacation. You have a community where you can vacation without leaving home because there's enough natural things to do is a benefit for community growth. And so we see the paradigm shift to conservation being no growth, to conservation being part of smart growth. And that's been another change in land management. We deal a lot more with developers and others who understand that the open space can add economic benefit to their development. The Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission did studies several years ago that showed the statistics behind all that. And that the idea that development and land conservation are important, and that creating and utilizing open space in the community is designed as appeal, value, sustainability. And the other aspect of that we've seen a shift is we traditionally thought of open space as large polygons. Now we're thinking of it as large polygons connected by greenways, linked to open space, or linear open space becomes a new area of emphasis. If you have Peace Valley Park here and you have Central Park there, we want to connect those both for ecological reasons, for the trails and animals, but mostly for the people to be able to get from one to the other. So that, I think, is more and more important than what we're doing. So the idea that we think in terms of our community, that imagining a situation where every home was in 5 minutes to a community center or open space, or every child can walk to open space within several blocks, is more important. So the more urbanizing, suburbanizing areas are communities, protecting open space in those areas is becoming more and more important. So we learned open space isn't just a place for birds and the bunnies. It's a place that's a vital protection of locally grown food, natural stormwater facility, which I skipped through all those green infrastructure things, and it's a protection against global warming, which if we don't worry about that, everything else is rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. So that's all important to what we're doing, and they all have critical economic impacts for all of our residents. And we hope to establish a passion for the land. Connecting people with land, as I said earlier, has become one of our buzzwords. Land is a valuable asset, but it's more. I always make the analogy, your right arm is a valuable asset, but if somebody offered you $50,000, would you cut it off? Most people say yes. Most people say no. I'm trying to get more people to say no. And what we try to do is transform land from a commodity to the passion. And ultimately, conservation is a weapon against the destruction and decline of life as we know it. And it's important that we all get involved in it. And there is not enough public money to acquire. We've heard there's probably not in the best interest to acquire land for parks.